what we are going to do today is the next step after throwing our pieces, which will be trimming. So trimming kind of just refines our piece. I think it's really transformational. So take a picture of your piece before you trim it and a picture after, because a lot of times they look wildly different, especially when we're first learning. We sometimes will have excess clay accumulated in the bottom and kind of in the corners of our piece. So if I were to cut this in half and look at a cross section, a lot of times we'll see extra clay accumulated right here, just because it's sometimes when we're learning hard to efficiently pull all of the clay up from the bottom into the walls. So trimming allows us to take away some of that extra clay, like lighten up our piece and also refine the shape. We will also learn about making a foot. So right now, your piece will potentially have some paper from this board. It will most likely, hopefully, have a pretty flat bottom, but there still will be some extra clay that we can kind of tidy up, and if we wanted to change the shape a little bit. So you can think of trimming as kind of carving away from our pieces. We do it when the clay is leather hard. So leather hard basically is just the perfect consistency where it's dry enough that we can pick it up like I'm doing right now, and it doesn't just completely smush like it would if we tried to pick our piece up right after throwing it. But it's still soft enough that we can carve into it and carve away the clay. Hopefully, if you get it at the right consistency, you get these really satisfying ribbons of clay that kind of come away as you're trimming. I find trimming very soothing. Like I could watch trimming videos just like as a relaxation. I find it really. So hopefully you'll have a similar experience after we've learned. So we also, when we trim, can do what is called adding a foot to our piece. So we could keep the bottom of our piece flat. We would want to make sure that it's completely flat. There isn't any clay sort of bulging in the bottom, which can happen sometimes when it dries. Then you would get this sort of rocking effect on the table, which would be quite annoying if it was you're trying to use for eating or drinking out of. So putting a foot on our piece, this is an example of a foot. It's basically kind of the ring that your piece is sitting on. Helps to make sure that we can really take away that excess clay. You can even take some out of the very center and shape away from it. And then while still maintaining that even sort of flush sitting on the table, it's kind of just a refined step. Some potters like to have a really defined foot so that even when it's sitting on the table, you can really see like a deep foot and see the definition between your piece and the foot. You don't have to do one like that. You can also still achieve the same thing where you're taking away clay from the bottom while sort of making an invisible foot where when it's sitting on the table, you wouldn't actually know that there is clay taken out of the center there. You can also, I don't know if you want to example of it, but here's one. If you want to notch into the foot, that's something that people do as well, so that when you have it, for example, in the dishwasher, water isn't pooling in this area and is able to run off. Just a choice. You don't have to do that at all. But it's just some things to think about when doing the foot. And trimming is also a time when we can add texture to our piece. So I'll show that when I'm demoing, but you can add in sort of stripes or different texture, and you could also carve away from your piece. If you wanted to make holes in it or freehand write "I love you, mom" on your piece or whatever, this would be the consistency that we would do that in. Looking at this, which is something that has holes in it, brings up a good thing that we always want to remember, which is how thick the bottom of our piece is. So when we were trimming it off the wheel, if you happen to see the wire tool going below your piece and you could see it moving underneath, chances are the bottom of your piece is quite thin. We will all check out how thick the bottoms of our pieces are so that we kind of have a good idea of how deep we can trim this foot without going through the bottom. That being said, if you accidentally trim through the bottom of your piece, you just now have a plant pot with drainage or a colander or whatever else. You can come in and continue to make more holes, but we will try to be cognizant of how thick the bottom is so that we make sure we're taking precautions to not trim through. Any questions?
Question.
Yeah.
We want to trim out excess because it's just otherwise gonna explode, like we too wet in there.
So if it's, that's a great question. If it's super, super thick, like if you had a piece that had like a couple inches on here, then yeah, it's harder for your piece to fully dry out. So you have a higher risk that when we put it into the kiln, there's still some moisture in there that would try to be released as steam and therefore crack or explode. But other than if it's like super thick, it's really just kind of refining your piece and trying to lighten it up. Because we a lot of times have that extra chunkiness when we're learning that you just don't want your piece to be super heavy when you pick it up. But yeah, some people will throw and like try to refine everything in the throwing process and not really trim. But yeah, it's mostly just refining it, unless it was really, really thick and then.
Can you trim from like the inside part?
We don't usually, like, ideally you don't want to trim the inside. You want to just get everything set up when you're throwing so that when you take it off, we will trim upside down. I'll show you the way that we usually do it here, where we'll actually seal our piece to the wheel, and having the negative space in here helps kind of create a vacuum that really seals your piece down. Whereas if you have it right side up, it's harder to get that really set. We can put some anchors on it if you really need to trim the inside, but it's a little bit of an awkward process and like
dangerous. Like I
could
saw
be
a
a
video,
little-
they're like, it's blind, you can't see what you're doing.
Yeah. And like if you're taking a very like traditional approach to throwing, then it's like you don't trim the inside. What we would do is if you have the edge of like the rim of your piece uneven, so which would inhibit you from being able to like put it flush with the wheel head, then we would, with it right side up, try to trim it level.
So we might see that today.
We might. I think, I'm not sure if your pieces that'll be the case, but yeah, sometimes that is the case. We try to usually even it out when we're throwing, to avoid having to do that. But yeah, there are other ways we can do it. Like if you had a vase with a really tall neck or something like that, it would be hard to put upside down. We have other ways that you can put it into those little plaster things right there. They're called chucks. Is another way we can use for trimming. Or in that case, we just wouldn't turn it upside down, trim it right side up, and just really clean it up like that. Yeah, good question though. Any other questions?
I get the feeling, you know, when we were pulling up,
Yeah.
all those like tiny little micro movements, sort of. I have a feeling it's trimming is kind of like micro as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I will admit that my least favorite part of doing anything on the wheel is centering for trimming, because it is sort of like centering for throwing. You're kind of just, you need to learn how to use your body to really be able to push the clay where you want it to be. This is a much more like meticulous, tiny movements until it's perfectly centered. And there are little bits like that where if it's a little bit off, you can feel it when you're trimming. Yeah. Yeah. And we will use trimming tools for this rather than just our hands and a sponge, which we're mostly using for throwing. So that will be a difference as well. So what I'll do is I'll set up on this wheel. We'll all trim, or I'll do a demo, then we'll all trim our pieces, and then we'll probably have time to throw after that. Okay, so for trimming, for the most part, we'll use a couple of different tools, but we have a whole like, bunch of different ones you can try out. For the most part, we'll use this tool, which just has a larger surface area to really like take away a lot of clay. And then this one is my absolute favorite. I think you can use it for everything. I sometimes do only use this tool. It doesn't have as much of a cutting edge, so it's maybe not the most efficient, but I find you can control it a bit more. So if you're only going to grab one tool, this would be the one. But you can also play around with different shapes, like if you want to really round edges, or there's all different ones that you can try. So, like I said before, we're going to seal our piece upside down onto the wheel. The way that we're doing that is just by lightly dampening. Like I've squeezed the water out of the sponge before doing this. I'm not flooding the wheel. And then doing the same thing with the rim of our piece. And then, like I said, my least favorite part is we will center it on the wheel. So I'll just put it like super off center to really exaggerate this so you can see what I'm talking about. But if it was this off center, you can see at some points it's going way away from my finger, and then other points coming towards it because it's not in the center. That is essentially the same concept we're going to use, but just in much smaller distances to center our piece. So you can still see that at some points it's pushing my finger away, or if I move my finger away a little bit, you can see at some points it's coming closer to my finger and other points not. What we want to do is get it in the very center of the wheel. We could either look where it's further away from our finger with the wheel moving slowly and then compensate by tapping it lightly on the other side towards the finger, or I think it's sometimes easier to have a visual. I should say we are centering it from the bottom of our piece, which is now at the top, because that's where we'll do the majority of our trimming. That's where we'll trim our foot and trim away a lot of the excess clay. If for whatever reason our piece had its own unique lean to it and we were centering from down here, this part could be completely off center, and that would affect how our foot would look or what we're doing. So we're going to focus on centering from up here. So you can also hold a pin tool steady in one spot, and then you can see, okay, right here it's coming closer to the pin tool, and you can see it's just a tiny amount, and then we would just make like a micro nudge away. Sometimes it's your piece itself that maybe has a little bit of clay that sticks out on one side. So we'll get it as centered as we can. You want to essentially be able to, like when you're holding your hands on your piece, see that it's not, that it would feel centered the same way as when we're throwing, and we feel that it's not wobbling or pushing our hands away. So you can really kind of get a feel for that. It would just a lot of times be like a very tiny amount. You can also check on the top, which is the bottom, but right now on the top, by just drawing or slightly carving in some like concentric circles to check that they're, you know, making circles in the right, if your piece was super off center and then you're getting circles on this part of your piece versus right in the middle. Once we have it centered, then we're going to give it some good with the wheel spinning, keeping our hand here. We want to make sure that we are just tapping directly down onto the bottom of our piece to really seal it down to the wheel head, versus going from the side. You'll just undo all the work that you just did, which is so frustrating because then we have to start the tedious process again. I'll help you when we're doing this. If your piece, I'll check that they're pretty stuck on there, so that you don't start trimming and immediately throw it off and have to start over. So the more you practice, the better. So once we have our piece stuck down, the first thing I usually do is kind of clean up any excess clay that we might have here that just is a little bit untidy from when we were throwing, and then even out the bottom. The bottom of this one is fairly even, but sometimes, depending on how it's sitting on the board, it will have, like you can see here, there's a little bit of paper, and it'll have some uneven bits from when we cut it off the wheel. So that's the first thing that I usually do. It will also help, like if you have extra things that are making it hard for you to center, that are kind of sticking out of your piece, helpful to trim them off and then really get an idea, okay, it is centered. So for trimming, we are usually holding our trimming tool in two different ways. We're either holding it with the wider blade against our piece and then kind of working at whatever angle we want, or we're going straight in, which I'll show when we do the foot. So for this part, also important, I have one hand always in contact with the piece, and I'm also keeping my hands connected. So they're working as one tool in the same way that we keep our hands connected for throwing. I always have my hands as much as possible either in contact with the piece or right next to it. You might maybe have amazing reflexes. I do not. If your piece gets bumped off, you want your hand to be able to catch it there before it flies across the room. Even though our clay is like sturdy enough that we can pick it up and move it now, it's still quite fragile in the sense that, like, if I were to drop this on the ground, it will just break more so than if it was fired. So we still want to make sure we have our hands there to catch it if it happens to fly off. So here's where we'll just shape up this part, take off any excess clay if we needed to, and then do the same thing on the bottom. We could use this wider tool, which sometimes, depending on if some of these are a little dull, can make quite the nails on the chalkboard noise. But we would just make sure the bottom is even, take any excess sort of lumps that were on there from when we cut it off. And then you can pass me that brown mug. So then we would look at where we want to do our foot. This would be, in this case, the outside line of our foot, and then this is what I will call the inside line, just what determines how wide our foot is and where we'll mark it on here. I recommend always starting with your foot wider than you want it to end up. Reason for that is, I'll show you when we're doing it, but when you're trimming away, if you accidentally gouge your foot a little bit, which can happen, if you have extra area to work with, then you can kind of then go in and then make it thinner. If you've already made your foot as thin as you want it and you take a little extra out, you don't really have any wiggle room there. So what we'll first do is define our outside line. You want to, same thing as when we're throwing, you're not coming into contact with the clay unless the wheel is spinning. If I were to put my tool where I want it and then turn the wheel on, it will just take my hand and I will not be getting these perfect circles, which is what I'm trying to achieve. So we'll have the wheel spinning, and then we're using just this very little corner tip. And same thing, hands are connected. The most important thing is that you just go into the spot that you want, and then you're just staying there. And like I said with the throwing, we're letting the wheel distribute the action that we're doing on the clay. So in this case, I'm trying to carve a line in. I'm letting the wheel fully distribute that carving of a line into the circle, not worrying about my hand moving with the wheel. It's just staying in one spot. So I'll choose right here to be where I want my outside line. And there you can see that it gets just carved in. Now, if I wanted to kind of exaggerate the definition or just really make it be defined between the body of my piece and the foot, we would take away some clay from right here. And here's where we can really think a little bit about the shape of our piece. So this is kind of a rounded piece already. So I would probably, in this case, want to maintain that rounded edge. If you wanted to do something more angular, rather than this motion of continuing to round it, you could just hold your trimming tool at the angle that you wanted and kind of create a one plane and another, depending on if you wanted something more angled. You could use even like a flatter trimming tool and really exaggerate, you know, between those two lines. But you can really play around with that. So we have our outside line right here. I'll define it a little bit more so we can see the foot. And then now we'll need to mark our inside line. So I would probably make my foot about this wide, a little wider than that maybe for this piece, but I'm gonna go ahead and make it wider, and then I'll show you what happens if your hand catches. So same thing I did before. I'm gonna go in to the point where I want the inside line to be. And now I can see the thickness of my foot. So now I have this extra clay in the center that I want to take out. So here's where it's important that we're always working from the center to the right when we're trimming. Because of how the wheel's spinning, if we work to the left of center, it's more likely that it will catch your hand. So the safe zone is kind of center right. So I'll think about going from this point just all the way out to the line that I just created. Even though what we're doing is clearing all of this out, just try to focus on the line being from here to here. Like I said before, you're moving your hand slowly and the wheel is distributing that all the way around. What you're essentially doing is making a spiral all the way to, I'll show you, it makes more sense, but, and we're just going all the way out to the line that we just created. If you move your hand faster than the wheel, then you'll make wider spirals. If you continue moving your hand slowly, just millimeter by millimeter, you make just one continuous spiral that's kind of clearing all of that play out. If you like this pattern, you can leave it there or just turn your tool to the side and you can smooth out the bottom. The nice thing about this tool is that it has this heel right here, so it kind of naturally stops right at that line that you've created. So I'll show that again. We're just going from the center and then slowly taking it out to that line that we've created. If, when you're doing that, you get to this point and then something distracts you and you kind of, okay, now I've gone into my foot a little bit, just barely, but you can see right here, like I've gouged it a little bit. Luckily, I have some extra room to work with, so I can just go to the point that I gouged it from and just now have a narrower foot. But if I already had a super narrow foot to begin with, that would have been maybe 5 by foot altogether. Any questions about this part of making the foot? No? Okay. The other thing that we want to do is, as much as possible, not have any sharp edges, especially on something that's going to be on the bottom of our piece because it won't be glazed. You don't want there to be any rough or sharp edges if you were to hold this in your hand. So what we'll usually do is just round out just by very like micro sort of movements on the edges of it to smooth that out. Now, if I didn't want there to be this definition between my piece and the foot, like in the example of that picture that I showed, then we could just not have this line right here and have the wall of our piece just float into the foot and have it kind of be like a seamless transition that you wouldn't necessarily see if your piece was right side up on the table. This is also, like I said before, where we could add in texture to our piece. So if we wanted to have, say, a stripe, we would just, similar concept to what we were doing over here, but just holding it on the side and using this same little pointed tip, holding it steady in one place. And in this case, carving a stripe. You could do another stripe. So if you want to just a straight line, you're just holding it in one place. If you want there to be more of a sort of random or like undulating texture, then we're just moving it. You can see that creates that sort of texture, which can look really nice with the glaze, because the glaze will kind of float into the texture. You can trim all the way down to the bottom of your piece, which will be the rim. Especially if, which I think a lot of pieces that we made last week could be potential mugs that we would maybe want to drink out of. So you don't want there to be a really thick rim, which would be the lip of your mug. If you have some texture and then you decide you don't want it, you can just also get rid of it. But that is the general idea of trimming. You can see it's really just about refining your piece, adding in any of those sort of details that you want in terms of texture, and really thinking about the shape of your piece in terms of how you want it to curve or not curve, kind of how you want that shape to be. And really just also lightening up any excess weight that you have in your piece.
How fast are you going at like full speed?
Going about like a little less than medium speed. It actually gives you more control if it's going a bit faster. Like if you try to trim with it really slow, it's more likely that your hand will kind of catch. So it's easier to kind of keep it at this medium speed and then be able to just hold your hand in one position and really kind of keep that steady. So that's a good question. So yeah, even though I know it can feel intimidating to have the wheel going faster, it actually makes the trimming smoother. It's less likely that it will kind of catch and pull your hand. So the next step, well, the final step, I should say, before we take it off the wheel, will be to write our name on it. So we'll choose a point on the bottom of our piece and then write our name. Your name has to be, well, as you know, it has to be a unique identifier. So if your name starts with A, don't just write A on here because it's hard to know who that is. So yeah, it needs to be a way that we can know each one, and it should stay consistent throughout the class. I say this because sometimes people will give these as gifts, and then rather than writing their name, they'll write like to grandpa, like to mom on the bottom of their pieces, and then I have no way of knowing who they are. So a unique identifier, which usually and then most simply is your name, but not just your initials. We'll write that on there. You can either write your name with the pen tool, or I find it easier to use a pencil. And then you're just writing the same way you write your name. I always end up looking like I write in kindergarten when I write on clay. I don't understand why some people have these like beautiful signatures, but it doesn't matter. You're just writing your name on the bottom of your piece, and then you're ready to take it off. To take it off, you're just gonna pull straight back towards your belly button, and then you can usually, because we've just stuck it down, especially if it's something you're gonna drink out of, I recommend sort of just lightly running a sponge along the rim to round it out, kind of just squeezing, like pinching on either side so that you get more of a tapered lip to your, this was going to be a mug, say, and that it's not sharp at all. Kind of just add that final touch, and then you're good to go. Any questions? No? Okay, so what we'll do is I'll grab our pieces. We'll each grab our pieces over here and take them to the table so we can kind of take stock of how thick or thin the bottoms are and think a little bit about how we want to